They did not hear it all at once. The signal rose like tide through gravel, finding every crack where humanity had left a sensor, a dish, a wire. It pressed evenly on the noise floor, a wide, patient pressure, as if the universe had decided to lean a shoulder against every receiver and wait for them to notice. An undergraduate at the South African Array noticed first, not through brilliance, but boredom. Her task, mark spurious spikes, flag, satellite bleed. She had a mug that said astronomy is just detective work without suspects, and she was on hour 6 when the baseline crept. The graphs did not jump, they thickened. She frowned, checked them. Whether the instrument logs, the satellite ephemerides, it wasn't lightning. It wasn't a satellite. It was the sky itself, brightening in radio like dawn under the horizon. She wrote a note in the runbook, floor up by 0.2 decibels over wideband, C attached. Then, guilty, she messaged 3 friends. Weird. 2 hours later, a ham operator in Karachi couldn't find his favorite vacuum tube. The tube would not have helped. The interference, if that was what it was polite, not the jagged scream of a cheap power supply. He raised an eyebrow, spun the dial, found the floor higher everywhere like a tide that remembered every bay by name. He checked the forums. He wasn't the only one. Solar flare, someone asked. Not with this signature, someone else. Answered. The Karachi operator set T2 steep and told his nephew to write down frequencies. When the world makes a sound, he said, you write fast before you forget the tune. On the Neptune Gate, a logistics platform older than many of its crew, a tug pilot stabbed at her console and swore that the docking radar had gotten heavy. Heavy how? Asked the quartermaster, already annoyed with the slow stream of ore. Canisters they were supposed to pack for the inner system, like it wants to drag my eyes, the pilot said. And the quartermaster did not have an entry in his procedures for instruments that want in. A teacher switched the lesson plan mid-sentence and drew a horizon on the smart. Imagine the sea rising everywhere at once, she told 12 children, even in cups and kettles, even in the lungs of fish. That is what the radio is doing now. The children blinked. One raised a hand and asked if that meant aliens. The teacher said, it means something large is speaking softly. They went to the window and watched clouds like obedient sheep, as if the sky might answer the question with shapes. The warning did not confine itself to human machines. On a pilgrimage ship above the coral moons of Ankhat, a choir mother in a robe of sound paused mid-hymn and pressed a hand to the ship wall. The hull sang back a note that was not hers. In the gun monastery of the TOC, a war priest stopped reciting the litany of acceptable targets and listened to the Kumnet ghost still around him. The traders of the Ket syndicate lifted the lids on Farland's arrays and sniffed. Something old. They clicked to each other, which in the Ket language is said with the same anatomy you use to say dangerous. Across the arm, automated observers did what observers do. They wrote. The Observatory of Quiet Objects wrote a bulletin in bullet quiet. Prose full of numbers that stacked like sober chairs. The ragpicker's telescope a pirate, array in a gravity gutter wrote, an ode about silver whales. A private AI in a lunar data vault, paid to notice patterns that would give its owner an edge in freight futures, wrote 3,000 lines of speculative poetry, and then bought water ice options that would not pay out for 5 years. Humans gave the pressure a name, because naming makes things holdable. They watched the riser change shape slowly, as a sculptor's thumb changes a lump of clay, smoothing edges, thinning here, thickening there. The riser favored no band and all bands. It preferred to be noticed not by particular ears, but by the idea of listening itself. Somewhere in the old Pentagon's digital bones, which survived as a legal fiction glued to newer rooms full of newer anxieties, a junior analyst with a talent for filing classified things under unclassified names opened a long archived document and felt her skin pebble. The page was a scan. The scan was of fax paper, and across the top someone had typed EAM-protocol-12, fallback tones. The fallback tones described a rising pressure across the radio floor. They described it exactly. Her cursor hovered over the words dead protocol. She reached for coffee and found her hand shaking. Ma'am, she pinged her supervisor. We have a correspondence. It was not an emergency. No sirens wailed. But on ships and farms and city blocks, people found excuses to stay near radios. It felt like waiting for an orchestra to resolve a chord. When the message came, it was not in a human language, but it wore one like an amulet. Between the edges of the riser frictionless and patienta, subcarrier clicked to life with a rhythm that belonged to an earlier century. Old rigs coughed to attention, and new rigs pretended they were old. The encoding was half a joke, like a god scrawling in crayon. Teletype, Manchester. The familiar ugliness of it charmed even the skeptics. The text was spare, unadorned, and cold as a checklist. Protector of man reacquiring lock on the time it took to say those 6 words, lawyers imagined jurisdictions. Pundits prepped incredulity, preachers reached for parables. The uncle in Karachi looked at his nephew's careful handwriting and let out a sound that was either a laugh or a sob. The tug pilot at Neptune Gate whispered, "What protector?" And the quartermaster, who collected rumors like stamps, said, "One we used to tell stories about when we were drunk, and no one could find a window to throw us out of." A man in Lagos who made a living writing meticulous code to make chaotic networks behave wrote a quick parser for a dead protocol because it felt like coming home. He posted it with an apology for messy comments. A woman in Chelmno, whose day job was cataloging museum pieces no one requested, recognized the phrasing from a field note in an expedition diary dated 400 years after the diary's date. She did not understand how that was possible, but she wrote to the man in Lagos anyway, and because people love to connect, they're strange, a thread began. Governments were slower, because governments must be. They issued statements heavy with verbs. That meant nothing specific. Monitoring, assessing, coordinating. The people, meanwhile, did not coordinate, and yet did. Someone made a shared spreadsheet titled, "Things We Are Hearing." And within hours, it had become the sort of organism that grows in the flattering dark of collective purpose. Tabs for frequency. Tabs for instruments. Tabs for this is probably nothing. But inside jokes bloomed at cell A1 and cell Z999. A clown emoji marked an older hoax. A sunflower marked a verified dish. No one asked who had made the sheet. No one needed to. On the blue line under Boston, a busker swapped his guitar for a battered radio and played static like a harp. In a kitchen in FE's, a grandmother told a story about jinn who come as winds, and she was right in spirit, if not in species. An orbital welder took a break, floated to the window of the canteen, and pretended she could see the Oort with human eyes. The riser did not crest. It abided, and in its abiding, certain patterns became visible exactly because they were absent. There were no blips that looked like weapon sighting, none of the jitter that accompanies a million independent transmitters trying to talk at once. The riser did not care about anyone's preferred channel. It was an environment, not a conversation, that did not stop conversations. Speculation is oxygen to the species that enjoys breathing. If this was the protector, why had it slept? If it had not slept, how long had it watched, and how had they missed it? Was it human-made and lost, or human-adopted and found? A soldier in a windowless room translated the word protector into 8 languages and wrote beside each a note about how it could be misunderstood. A child wrote the same word in crayon and surrounded it with planets with smiling faces. Both labors had dignity. Both were true dot at the edge of human reach, where probes and survey skiffs shared the slow light of the Kuiper with tourists who wanted to say they'd been far. A weathered instrument cluster stamped with the logo of a company that had died. Century ago pinged a heartbeat. The ping was plain no riddles, no flourish, only an acknowledgement that its bearings had acquired context. The skiff pilot on watch, who had been reading an old detective novel, allowed to keep herself from falling. Asleep, put a finger on the page and listened. The ping repeated. "Well then," she said to the 100,000 kilometers of nothing in front of her, "whoever you are, you've got manners." In the monastery gun of the Toque, the war priest finished listening and instructed the gunners to remove their hands from the polished grips. "We will not be first," he said. "We will be third or fourth." The choir mother on the Ancot pilgrimage ship would later write a hymn without verbs, because the action belonged elsewhere. The ket traders began to price risk as a form of prayer. Humans, being human, looked for work to do. They tuned, recorded, cross-checked. They argued agreeably about the best filters. They remembered that not all ears were equal and that the universe did not care about the budget committee's last decision. So they opened their networks to hobbyists and to amateur observatories whose pride was old but flexible. Grandmothers in soup kitchens erected antennae made of foil and wire hangers because someone on the spreadsheet posted a diagram with annotations in patient blue. The signal's politeness felt like a decision. It could have bent them without asking. Instead, it brushed everything just hard enough to gather their attention into one place. That counted for something. It did not ask permission, but it asked presence. Someone noticed, long past midnight on a tiny island where the power flickered twice a week, that the subcarrier rode not on noise but on a carefully flattened floor, as if the riser actively smoothed the chaos under it. The student wrote floor normalization, circled it twice, and fell asleep with her face on the keyboard. In the morning, her supervisor saw the note and added, in a neat hand, friendly to weak ears. The second line arrived with a timing that felt like kindness. It did not rush. When it came, it slotted itself into every parser the Logos coder had written and all the ones rewritten by others while he slept. Stand by for integrity check. 1,000 jokes bloomed, press any key to continue, but the laughter had an edge. Integrity checks happened before surgery. The man in the windowless room underlined the phrase and sent it up 3 chains. The quartermaster at Neptune Gate adjusted his collar, suddenly aware that his shirt was a little too tight, a little too attention-seeking. Integrity of what? The tug pilot asked. Of us, the quartermaster said before he could stop himself, then shook. His head, no of itself. If you were a big old myth, and you wanted to be sure you were the same one who went to sleep, you'd count your bones. Bones? The pilot repeated, liking the word in her mouth. Our bones? It's bones. Maybe both. The riser's pressure eased fractionally, as if to say, I am not here to harm your instruments. The tiny mercy made hearts lighter in rooms where no one had spoken in 10 minutes. Someone somewhere began to hum, and the hum traveled through walls, because that is what sound does when it is invited. A child in the Laguna classroom asked the teacher if the protector would be like the dragon in a book she loved, great and old, and a little bit lonely. The teacher bent down so their noses almost touched. If it is what I think it is, she said, it will be great and old and not lonely at all. It will know us better than we know ourselves because it learned us slowly and decided to keep us. How can a thing decide to keep people? The child asked, genuinely curious, not frightened. By making room for our noise, the teacher said. By not insisting on hush, the galaxy watched. Its worklands paused their drills and counted ammunition with slightly less conviction. Its priesthoods hedged prophecies. Its syndicates updated spreadsheets, in private and smiled in public. Even those who had never learned the word human in any pronunciation found themselves marking a new symbol on their star charts, a circle. Not marked do not enter, but be quiet near dot the riser held. The subcarrier waited, somewhere beyond the cold fence of the Oort, in a dark crowded with comets. Like frozen fruit, something oriented itself with the care of an old craftsman taking a tool from a shelf. The people on the spreadsheets, the radios, the docks, the kitchens. The classrooms breathed in together and did not yet breathe out. And then, very gently, like a curtain lifting on a stage, everyone pretended they had not built. The noise floor began to part around a contour that was not noise at all. The shape was not visible yet. It was a negative, a place where interference failed to be. But even that absence carried a promise. They felt it as a difference in their instruments, their habits, their language. They felt it in their bones, which are, after all, antennae for the body's own quiet storms. Humanity, tuned by need and luck and long practice to hear the first drumbeats of its own stories, leaned toward the Oort and listened for the protector. They went hunting through their own past first, because that is where humans keep the tools for unfamiliar futures. Archivists spun up cold servers and opened frostbitten folders whose file names looked like sneezes. Linguists took shifts with historians, both humbled by the peculiar grammar of panic, the way a culture labels things when it thinks. Tomorrow might not arrive. The phrase, everyone could agree on protector of man reacquiring, Locke did not arrive. Alone, it pulled old phrases with it, like a net dragging bottles. Aegis, the sleeper, the wall that walks, the halo in the hail. Each label belonged to a different century sphere. Each pointed, like trembling compasses, toward a single silhouette that had lived too long in footnotes. A curator in Chelmno, who spent her days in a museum most schoolchildren mistook for a library, posted a scan nobody had asked her to make. A field note from a backwater expedition dated 200 years before the expedition took place. The ink was a lie. The paper was older than its words. Yet there it was, EGI, ascribed with a bureaucrat's unromantic hand. She paired the image with a paragraph of modest questions. The post found the Lagos coder by obvious roots and stranger ones. He answered with the deliberate kindness of someone who has been lost before and been found by someone else's careful prose. They began a shared lexicon and called it the Glossary of Echoes. It was not a scholarly text, though scholars came. It was a quilt. Each entry bound a rumor to a citation, a story to a signal. Sailors' stories from the age of cheap fission. A wave of cargo manifests where half the containers were listed as Starlight spares, and none of those parts fit any known machine. A panicked assembly bill with a line item for mirrorbone trusses and a signature that belonged to a person who, by every other record, never existed. The lexicon did not prove in the strict sense, but it let people point together, and the pointing taught them to see. While people named the sky obliged, the first photos came dirty and argumentative, long exposures of starfields with nothing sensible to circle. Then a subtraction image, where the subtraction left not a smudge, but a refusal and absence that was too neat to be chance. Sensors at the Kuiper perimeter felt gravity walk by them like a careful parent carrying a sleeping child. The Neptune Gates radar stopped feeling heavy and began to feel guided, as if a hand had slipped over the instrument to show it how to behave in the presence of a living thing. A weathered skiff at the belt's edge caught the first true glint. Its pilot had been reading aloud to stay awake. Now she drifted the skiff behind a husk of rock and watched the dark try not to be on her second pass. She saw the glint again, not at one point, but at many specks that brightened, dimmed, then kept brightening, their rhythm too disciplined for comets, too impartial for weaponry. The pilot tagged the light curve and sent it in with the plain caption, unfolding, the tag leaped oceans. The mirrors did not bloom. Blooming is a plant's style, and this was the work of bones and joints. They articulated, arrays unfolded in slow, obvious lines from a central spine that refused to be seen, until it chose to reveal its shape through what it did to light and heat. The arrays used dust as fabric. They drank photons the way a disciplined person hydrates before a long climb. They practiced dot from the planet. Telescopes sharpened their scorn into admiration. The South African undergrad who had first said weird, now whispered beautiful to an empty control room and wrote a note no one would see about how she had never liked cathedrals until she watched one assemble itself at the border of the sun's long winter. Aegis, said the crowd, not in the tone of a child naming a pet, but as people address a thing that has already picked its own name. The word pulled ahead of its rivals for reasons that had little to do with etymology. Shield implied cowering. Wall implied separation. Sleeper implied negligence. Aegis implied standing with it. Walked through languages well enough, it landed, gently on tongues that had never needed Greek myths. The machines agreed in their own way. Someone found in the dead protocol's teeth a field-tagged ID that mapped to a hex string that mapped to an archaic checksum that should not have survived 100 software fashions and yet decoded, clean as it had been yesterday, to AEGIS01, that -1 made stomachs flip and steadied them again. If there was a first, there could have been a second. But could have been did not imply was. People admirably put down the catastrophe fanfic and picked up spectrographs. Spectroscopy said this: the mirrors were not mirrors as a household understands them. They were thin films hung on braidwork, layers that resonated with specific bands. Then slacked layers that could choose to be windows in one direction and lakes in another. Spectroscopy also said the spine held something that looked like smart iron grown in a field of magnet and whisper. Magnetic bones, wrote a graduate student at MIT with a private sense of triumph that the phrase from her childhood comics had turned out to be technical. The shape did not seek conversation with the galaxy's learned societies, not even the ones that prided themselves on not needing to be sought. It did not ping the Ket traders with price-rational greetings. It did not offer the toque a duel. It pointed its face. If face is the right word for a complicated bloom of optically active surfaces, arranged not to be a weapon, but to be seen. As not a weapon at Earth, the intent was indecently clear. War priests and syndicate, economists and choir mothers watched their networks tangle in a way that implied etiquette, budgets, hymnals. Each faction discovered the same uncomfortable truth. The terrifying part was not the object. It was the species toward which the object oriented, like a compass, resolves toward north. On Earth, governments wrote sentences that had only nouns and prepositions in them. The Aegis object appears to be in an unfolding phase near the inner Oort Cloud. That was safe. The safer drafts sat in secure folders with titles like Impact and Rules and What we will not say out loud. Those drafts were not safe at all. People did the unglamorous things. Dockworkers at Series Inventory checked bulkheads as if inventory could be a spell. Community radio stations reconfigured their shelves to make room for bigger power supplies that would be stolen and then returned because someone's grandmother called someone's cousin. A high school robotics club in Manila printed brackets for a dish upgrade nobody remembered. Authorizing the Karachi ham soldered a new balloon and pretended his hands did not shake. The Aegis sent no voice, but it did send a courtesy, a star map with the names scraped off. It revealed itself by subtraction, smoothing the radio floor around the bright noise of certain pulsars, as if to say, "Here are your lighthouses. I have triangulated. We agree on the sky." Astronomers who live on triangulation fell a little. In love, the courtesy doubled as an integrity check, a way of measuring itself against the fixed hum of the universe. It was taking stock, counting bones, collocation with old Lagrange scaffolding, said a quiet engineer in a think tank that once built things and now mostly wrote reports. She'd been around long enough to recognize old signatures. Someone, a go-seated anchors out there. Her colleagues looked at her without blinking. Anchors implied intent. Intent implied consent. Consent implied a contract with a signer nobody could subpoena. The glossary of echoes grew a new tab. Legally actionable fairy tales. The Chelmno curator, astonished and delighted to be a co-author of actual history, wrote an entry on the last nearfall, a phrase so bland it had hidden in plain sight across centuries. The entry did not assert. It aggregated crop failures and brilliant patents out of nowhere. Quiet relocations of budget lines. A run of obituaries that read like promotions. The Logos coder contributed footnotes that sang in clear code. Fragments of an old firmware tree whose branching logic included functions named watch, wait, wake. He checked the checksums 3 times. Not because he mistrusted his hands, but because it felt like a prayer. Kids listened. A teacher over Laguna de Bay printed the Aegis silhouette as best she could and taped it to the window, where sunlight poured through its spine and threw a shadow like a question mark onto the floor. "It is not pointing a gun at us," she told her class. "It is pointing itself. If it wanted to be frightening, it could do that without our help." At Neptune Gate, the tug pilot, whose mouth liked the word bones, watched her console spill numbers that made the hair on her arms rise. The object respected the lanes without being told what a lane was. It pushed just enough dust to give human instruments a good look, then held its metaphorical breath while the look was taken. It moved in ways that told anyone watching that it understood the difference between dominating traffic and not being a hazard. The gate's quartermaster rumor collector, shirt to tight, wrote a note in his ledger. "If it were human, I would hire it as a stevedore with guarantees." Someone, somewhere, calculated energies and found them more like budget lines than like boasts. The Aegis had power, obviously. You do not rearrange darkness without buying the bill, but the curve of its consumption spiky here, frugal, like someone who had disciplined themselves to live within means and was proud of never paying rush charges. That felt human in a way that made throats close. The second courtesy arrived, a thermal map over time, released into the same old protocol, like a gift tucked into the pages of a beloved book. It showed swaths of low orbit, medium orbit, high. It showed the phases of human traffic, daytime and night, not by sunlight, but by ambition. No labels, no judgments, only marveling. The Logos coder overlaid it on a flight log and wrote in their shared channel, "It knows us the way a tailor knows a client, By seam and strain, the name settled. News anchors said Aegis without wondering if they should. Children learned to draw it the way they had once drawn dinosaurs and rockets, spine first. Then the fan of mirrors that were not mirrors. Then dots for the anchors they could not see but could imagine. The Karachi ham told his nephew that names are tools useful, that Aegis had the weight of a hammer rather than the sting of a needle. The nephew nodded, as if he understood because he understood enough. Across the arm, the non-human watching learned the name too, because names travel faster than physics when they hitch rides in songs and jokes and purchase orders. The toque recorded the human word in their war prayer with an asterisk that meant do not test casually. The Ket updated risk indices and, in private, among family, clicked a softer equivalent of good luck to them. The choir mother of Ankot graded a hymn into a lower key and found that the ship's hull liked to sing with it, which meant something she did not yet know how to preach. The Aegis did one more visible thing. It rotated through attitudes that did not make sense as showing off and made perfect sense as calibrating for a specific disk of debris, satellites, and hope. It gathered sunlight along paths that favored Earth's night as if it preferred to be seen by the people most awake at 3 a.m. Then, aligning its spine to the ecliptic with a patience that was more courtesy than necessity, it steadied, not at us precisely, but with us in the center of its plan. It did not hail, not a word for the galaxy, not a whisper for rival empires. It faced Earth like a craftsman, opening a well-lit tool roll at the kitchen table, beckoning the household to look. The radio floor remained smoothed in that ridiculous, generous, way-friendly, 2-week ears, and the subcarrier waited like a held breath for whatever protocol came after hello. I remember you. In living rooms and labs and docks and temples, people reached the same quiet verdict without talking. The frightening thing was not that humanity might hide behind a shield. The frightening, hopeful thing was that a shield had come home and had asked, in the only language it trusted, whether its makers would like to inspect the work. Asterisk, asterisk, across the arm. A hush arranged itself with more discipline than any treaty. Were no summonses, no gilded invitations, only the etiquette of terror. Listen, record, do not provoke. Worklands muted drill chants and counted their ammunition as if counting could become a prayer. Syndicate economists spoke in the codes of weather reports, unsettled in the inner spiral, avoid the shoals near Seoul, and quietly doubled insurance rates for anyone plotting a course through the neighborhood of the blue world. Choir mothers transposed prophecies into lower keys. Historians did what they always do at the edge of a new thing, opened old books and made tea. The Aegis, meanwhile, did not speak. It drew a line. It did not paint the line with color or sound. It wrote it into the behavior of light and whined into the way particles and fields meet when they disagree. A bubble formed around Seoul that was not a bubble, a sphere that was not a wall. Those inside did not feel fenced. Those outside did not feel locked out. But anything inside the calculus of weapon found its math go soft at the boundary. As if there were a grammar school teacher standing at the edge of the playground, arms folded, smiling politely, and refusing to let bad conjugations through. The first to test it were not navies. They were the usual opportunists who confuse absence of noise with absence of notice. A pirate cutter out of the hyacinth debris, name scrubbed to numbers by a registry no honest customs agent used, slid toward the heliopause to take advantage of nervous traffic. Its captain had a good eye and a worse philosophy. Strike where eyes are busy. Leave before anyone makes meaning of you. When a freighter refused her ping, she warmed a lance and tasted the usual thrill of coherence as the beam stiffened along its guided path. The beam left the emitter like a thought. It met the boundary like a bad argument. It bent not diffused, not shattered, simply persuaded into a new curve by a field whose patience could break rocks. The lance arced like a reed in slow current, brushed the cutter's own radiators in a kiss that was more lesson than punishment, and went out. Heat bled into a ruffle of harmless aurora that walked itself along the boundary as if in apology. On the cutter's bridge, the captain's mouth formed the sentence, "What was that?" without making sound. Her gunner, who collected old metaphors, whispered, "We brought a shout to a library." The footage aired everywhere. There were eyes. Smugglers learned the way bright children learn in strict classrooms, rapidly with a blush. The Ket Syndicate broadcast a circular that used their softest click for "Do not try this again," and appended a clause in the family dialect that simply meant "please." Formal governments did the formal things. A council on a planet that never admitted to fear voted unanimously to direct captains to cold iron weapons within the sphere. A navy that had not lost a battle in living memory issued its first silence order and discovered its admirals had voices better suited to whispering than shouting. The Toke war priest, who had told his gunners to be third or fourth, reviewed the footage and added a line to the monastery gun's liturgy. In the presence of elders, holster. Inside the sphere, instruments breathed easier. The radio floor, which the Aegis had smoothed for weak ears, now showed anomalies that were not anomalies at all, but graces. Weapon harmonics flattened. Test pulses were absorbed and returned as useful calibration wobble. A Logos coder and a Chelmno curator, who had become by the simple trick of working adjacent to the center of the story. Read a thin packet in the dead protocol that was not words so much as a specification for courtesy. Maintain transponder, advertise failure states, declare intended vector changes greater than 1/10 C by 60 seconds, announce power excursions above threshold X, Y, Z. The thresholds were in units, no one used any more. The coder wrote a translator and posted it with the diff like a chef, leaving out a bowl of soup for a late shift guard. The Neptune Gates quartermaster, shirt still a little too tight for sense, watched traffic adapt. You could see it in the way tugs took wider turns, the way skippers called their intentions to beats earlier than pride liked. It looked like seamanship. It looked like manners, he wrote in his ledger. Sphere enforces better habits than any inspector we've ever had. Not all tests were insolent. An exploration frigate from a fastidious republic sent a respectfully underpowered ping directly at the boundary with a preamble that amounted to "Good morning. Might we learn the shape of you?" The ping came back with a phase shift that, when plotted, drew a rows of 8 petals an old math trick that told anyone who could read it where the sphere was most forgiving to traffic and where it leaned harder, guarding orbital paths rich with human debris. Astronomers, normally stingy with adjectives, called it kind. Newsrooms relearned a tone many had forgotten after decades of manufacturing outrage for sport. Anchors read the day's Aegis items as if they were shipping forecasts. Low chance of interference in mid-inclination transfer. Pirate lands phenomenon. Confirmed advisory to maintain safe distances from maintenance mirroring. Along the dawnside boundary, viewers did not switch away. Human beings, it turned out. Like calm when the stakes are cosmic. In kitchens and workshops. People argued about dignity and dependence with the care of engineers choosing fasteners. The Karachi ham poured tea and said to his nephew, a guard, "Who lifts a hand to steady you on a ladder is not stealing your rung." The nephew, who had a genius for questions that land where grown-ups pretend there is no earth, asked, "What if the guard forgets we're climbing and thinks the ladder is his?" The ham took a long time to answer. "Then we teach him again," he said, "or we climb another way. But first, we accept the steadying if it saves a fall." On the belt's ragged radio nets, dockworkers swore less and scheduled more. The teacher over Laguna de Bay marked the sphere's edge on a chalk globe and asked her class to imagine air you can't see that still insists you breathe better. A student drew the boundary as a dotted line, then erased half the dots because too many made it look like a fence. The Aegis continued its insistence on low drama. A co-aligned pair of microasteroids drifted onto a collision vector that would have sandblasted a swarm of satellites. Nothing exploded. Instead, the stone acquired a faint glitter, a skin of charged dust coaxed into a sail. The pair parted, slowed, and missed each other by a politeness calibrated to make ground controllers cry, then laugh, then cry again. When diplomats finally spoke to each other, it was to agree to an absence. No envoy would attempt a speech to the Aegis. No one would present symbols, plant flags, or perform grievances in front of the sphere like moths acting theater at a porch light. This was not humility so much as tactics. The most sophisticated players understood the obvious. The object had already chosen its audience. Still, they had to say something to their own. A global council on Earth published a document with a title, built out of nouns, approach, safety, continuity, and verbs chosen with tweezers. It affirmed that commerce would continue. that military assets would hold import status within the sphere unless explicitly tasked for rescue or remediation, and that any integrity queries from the Aegis would be treated as the highest priority civil defense communications. The phrase integrity query slid into the vernacular as easily as weather alert once had, a small navy on a small world. Insecure in a way only new powers are. Sent a patrol into the sphere with heat sinks flaring in a way that read as temper. Nothing. Broke Aegis rode a shadow around their ships that made sensors read their own noise back at them, louder than their bravado. The patrol withdrew, claiming a triumph that no one bothered to dispute. In mess halls, sailors told the story better. It made us listen to ourselves, one said, and the table nodded with the relief of people whose worst day did not end in memorials. The quiet court acquired rituals. In the first hour of every standard day, observatories across Earth posted their slice of the sphere's behavior in a shared ledger. And amateurs annotated the margins with delightfully wrong metaphors that sometimes turned out to be right. The glossary of echoes added a page for customs of the sphere. How to announce a burn so the sphere hears it. How to wrap a power plant's startup sequence in handshakes that keep the boundary from wincing. The Chelmno curator wrote the preface, not law, not lore, but courtesy that makes law unnecessary and lore less lonely outside the human bubble. Rival polities found themselves experiencing a new sensation, restraint that did not feel like defeat. A tow captain drilled her crew in docking procedures designed by strangers and discovered they were better. Ket customs officers, acutely alive to reputational risk, announced a Soul Corridor quiet bonus. Carriers who logged passage through the sphere would receive a rebate on port fees in 4 syndicate hubs. The rebate was small, but it tasted like a friendship. The Lagos coder woke one night with the sudden knowledge of a bug and found, not for the first time, that thousands of friends had already seen it, had already fixed it, had tucked the fix back into the ledger, laughing. The Chelmno curator drafted an exhibit text that would someday sit in a bright room beneath a suspended model of the Aegis, when the galaxy paused to see if humans would hide. Humanity answered with good paperwork and better radios, and within the hush, while the court held Aegis, kept time. It rotated through quiet attitudes that all said, "I am watching you, watch me." It trimmed its boundary as new traffic patterns emerged, slightly easing near a lifter corridor that the sphere must have recognized from centuries of blinking arcs in night. In the dark over ocean, airplane passengers on red-eyes built the same way as their grandparents' flights, and different in every way that mattered. Looked up at the tiny line of satellites that mark a species' first climatic sigh and felt, for the length of a heartbeat, protected without being cloistered. The question that people were afraid to ask aloud, "Are we going to hide behind it?" did not go away, but it lost some teeth. Hiding is a curl inward. This felt like a straightening of spines at the Neptune gate. The tug pilot bones and ladders and good words watched a cargo chain move like a practiced dance and said to the quartermaster, "It's quieter." He checked his too-tight collar and, for once, did not fuss with it. "Quieter like a well-run dock," he said, "where everyone already knows the steps." To call it safety would have been to jinx it. To call it judgment would have been to pick a fight with ghosts. The quiet court was something in between, a place where the galaxy looked in and, finding a species willing to abide by a set of nonverbal rules, made a rare choice to be still. And in that stillness, the Aegis waited, not as a wall, but as an elder at the edge of a game it once taught its children to play, ready to clap at the right catch, ready to call time if tempers flared, ready to let the game go on without calling every ball. Asterisk. Silence held, and humans answered it with noise, not the panic clatter of dropped pots, but the busy noise of a ship before dawn, brooms on deck, lists read out, small engines coughing to life, radios filled with voices, tutoring each other in acronyms that had never needed tutoring until now. Horns on harbor tugs practiced long patterns that meant nothing in law but everything to crews who liked to know the other boat had a heartbeat. The first map of this noise wasn't a sky chart, but a spreadsheet, its tabs multiplied. Like well-fed rabbits, receivers, relays, power supplies, young ears, old rigs. Translation. A Lagos coder and a Chelmno curator pinned a yellow note at the top that said, in plain letters, We will be wrong together, then right together. Please annotate. People did. Engineers corrected metaphors. Poets corrected tone. The result read, like scripture, with footnotes written by neighbors.kids, made themselves indispensable. A high school class in Quezon City turned the Aegis subcarrier into homework. They printed out Manchester-encoded blobs like dot paintings and circled patterns with highlighter hearts. A scout troop in Krakow built Yagi antennas out of broom handles and ambition. A teenager in Recife wrote a jitter filter that worked, best on radios assembled on a kitchen table. The spreadsheet added a tab just for them weak ears, Strong and the teacher over Laguna. Debay told her students that their ears were being treated kindly by something large, so they would return the favor by listening well. While the galaxy practiced not blinking, harbor tugs did what tugs always do. They made gigantic things behave. On the Neptune Gate, the tug pilot, who liked the word bones, spent an afternoon dragging freighters to degrees off their planned arcs, just a courtesy bend. She explained to captains who bristled until they saw what she meant, the Aegis. Boundary relaxed near the lanes where the bends became habit, as if it approved of choreography. The quartermaster, his collar still wrong and his ledger now holy, posted 3 rules on the dock bulletin that got copied to 1,000 other docks. Say your vector out loud. Declare your power before you light it. If you're late, say you're late, below, in smaller letters. No speeches inside the sphere. It wasn't law. It spread anyway because good manners ride faster than memos. The glossary of echoes sprouted. A working appendix called the courtesy stack. At first, it was 2 lines. Broadcast transponder state. Announce excursions above threshold. Then came examples in a dozen languages. Then code snippets for outdated rigs, still beloved by ships without budget, for replacements. Then a drama-free debate about whether the stack should include jokes too. Keep operators awake at 3 a.m. The compromise was perfect. Jokes allowed, but only in comments, never in headers. Grandmothers in soup kitchens discovered they were network engineers. Someone posted a diagram for a Foyland hanger antenna with notes like, "Don't burn your fingers," and "This is the good kind of static." Soup lines lengthened, but so did the coax cables feeding the little rigs propped on flour bags. Drink. A Karachi grandmother told a young woman who had just climbed 3 flights of stairs with a battery on her back. Then logged a 1400 UTC burst. We are feeding both kinds of hunger. The Aegis kept silent about its intentions and very vocal about its preferences. It liked transponders that confessed their faults promptly. It smiled if a sphere can be said to smile on vessels that sang their burns before they burned. Sensors. Inside, the quiet shell began to register. Tiny courtesies returned. A slight easing on plasma turbulence when maintenance crews announced power cycles. A measurable smoothing of interference over crowded ranges when neighborhood radio nets coordinated and synced their quiet minutes. It is listening to how we listen, wrote the Lagos coder in a comment thread. Then backed it with math that ran clean on cheap laptops. News tickers read differently now. Less thunder, more tied tables. Quiet bonus extended. The Ket Syndicate offered reduced fees for carriers that logged weapon-cold passages and clean courtesy stack compliance. Toke liturgy amended, an official note half prayer. Half safety bulletin urged crews to lay hands on grips only in memory. The words traveled because they were beautiful and useful in the same breath. Humans made liaison out of accident. The Lagos coder and the Chelmno curator were not appointed to anything. Yet everyone checked their channel before drafting a new practice. They wrote plainly, if your rig can't speak Protocol 12, use this shim. If your captain won't, speak it all. Let your tug speak for you. They avoided the temptation to act like prophets and stuck to being good secretaries. The curator began each daily digest with 2 sentences. Here is what we know. Here is what we are guessing. You could build a civilization on that tone, in the belts and on the blue world. Black sky drills began without being called drills. Hospitals rerouted emergency power through rigs that could whisper their status up to orbit. Water departments posted flow state hashes like offerings. A makerspace in Rabbi printed little interlocked tabs that clicked onto breaker panels and forced a person to read a checklist before they yanked anything drastic. Dignity, someone wrote on a wall. Beside a pile of tabs, not obedience. There were frictions, tiny and instructive. A freight company tried to sell a proprietary Aegis-ready certification and found itself gently but firmly ignored. 1,000 free checklists beat one shiny badge. An influencer announced he would be the first to interview the protector, and uploaded a video of himself shouting questions at the sky. The comments were kind in the way sharp knives can be kind. "Sir, this is a shipping forecast. Please declare your ego burn 1 minute in advance." He pivoted to Soup Kitchen live streams and found his metrics improved. The first real dialogue did not look like speech. It looked like a pulse train tucked into the riser that matched a human habit. At the top of each hour precisely, a subtle dip as millions paused to listen. Aegis damped local interference at those instants, as if it had noticed the ritual and decided to honor it. People called them hush marks. In those seconds, you could hear old satellites think. A university lab used a hush mark to teach. The undergrad from the early days stood at a whiteboard with a marker that had seen too much life and drew 3 boxes: noise, signal, courtesy. "We don't control the first," she said. "We shape the second. The third is where we meet." The elder. Someone posted the photo. It made its way to a church basement in Porto where a mutual aid group was labeling power strips, and a woman with tape on her sleeve lifted her head and said, "Elder, I like that." At the Neptune Gate, the quartermaster staged a drill without calling it one. A cargo chain accidentally stacked itself so that a delicate survey boat would be boxed behind Orcans unless someone gave way. Every captain guessed the trick, but guessing wasn't the point. They signaled, listened, and flexed their schedules by minutes, not pride. No one wrote an epic, someone wrote a line in a ledger. 5 ships arrived in their right order without remembering to be heroes. As for the galaxy beyond the bubble, its quiet continued, but lines of interest twitched like cat whiskers. A toque captain sent a message in formal human. "We are listening to your listening." The reply, drafted by a dockmaster in Marseille and a freight dispatcher in Tianjin, read, "Welcome to the quiet hours. Please declare your drills. Our children. Sleep then." The toque forwarded the note to their war priests, who added it to the liturgy under the heading Foreign Wisdom, the Chelmna. Curator assembled an exhibit that would never open at least not yet. She titled it The Human Noise and arranged the first room in her head. A wall of checklists printed in different hands. A table strewn with antennas made from ridiculous materials. A looped video of a tug easing a freighter's pride to degrees. To starboard, a speaker playing the low murmur of 100 radios saying calm words. She thought about admission fees, then laughed and wrote, "Pay what you can. Bring a battery." When Aegis finally moved, it was not to speak but to acknowledge. A packet slid into the dead protocol with a payload that was not text but an index of our own behavior reflected back at us. A summary of burns announced, power excursions declared and honored, hushmark participation plotted over cities and seas. At the bottom, a single machine straight line of letters arranged themselves into a sentence that any parser could catch and any child could read. Courtesy received. A cough went around the planet like weather. In kitchens and labs and docks, people put their hands on tables, rails, shoulders. The Logos coder typed, then erased, then typed again. "We hear you hearing us." The curator, who had spent years finding dignified words for old objects that stubbornly refused to explain themselves, wrote, "We accept your acceptance." The next minute sounded different, as if the air pressure had shifted a fraction toward. Good. Rain, the riser held. The hush mark came and went. Someone somewhere began to sing very softly, and someone else harmonized by accident, and no one made a speech. It would be easy to say humanity had organized, the truer sentence was smaller. Humanity had gotten busy in the right direction. In the hours that followed, an earthquake drill on one coast dovetailed with a power reroute on another. A convoy kept to its declared burn and laughed when a child on a balcony flashed a lamp in time with its engine. Aegis watched the pattern deepen, not as a warden ranks prisoners, but as a teacher counts breath with a class before the first lesson, and just before midnight in a dozen time zones. Whatever midnight means in a world with too many stars. Subcarrier offered a short familiar phrase that intercepted everyone's dreams. Stand by for integrity check. Voices stilled and pens hovered, not fearful, only attentive, as if an old friend had tapped the mic and said, "All right then. Let's make sure we're still ourselves." Asterisk, asterisk, the integrity check did not arrive as a quiz with numbered lines. It arrived as weather, small shifts that asked ships and cities to show the shape of their seamanship. Aegis counted bones its own, first, then ours, by watching how the body of a civilization flexed under gentle, undeniable load. The first nudge came at dawn over Venus, where dawn takes its time. A gravity flicker walked the planet's skirts like a careful tailor pinching fabric. It was not a shove. Instruments felt a gradient lean, a tide drawn a finger's width higher than yesterday. The effect was precisely wrong for panic and precisely right for checking. Whether navigators could feel with their elbows as well as their eyes, controllers in the inner system did the work without speeches. A survey skiff coming off a low pass announced a 2-second trim burn and made it sound like it was opening a window. An aerostat habitat half school, half refinery read the flicker in its cables and paid out slack in slow, fatherly pulses. The skiff's pilot, younger than the cables, kept humming to keep her hands steady and forgot she was being recorded. Later, the recording would become a training loop titled Hands that hummed. The Lagos coder watched the numbers from a desk where the only luxury was a cup too big for the saucer. He posted a note. Aegis is probing differential response, not absolute power. It wants to see if we dress ourselves without cursing the buttons. The Chelmno curator paired that with a picture of a 19th century dress form and a caption about practice making elegance look like nature. The spreadsheet added a tab. Lean days. The second nudge came dressed as the sun. Every culture has a word for a child's tantrum. The star prepared a small one-an eruptive loop that would have whipped a bright ribbon across the face of quiet if left alone. Not civilization ending, just the sort of spit that sprays control rooms with unplanned tasks, the sort of weather that makes you see who remembers to check the neighbor's power before flipping your own. The riser smoothed, then flared. Aegis did not smother the tantrum. It bracketed it, coaxing magnetic lines a little wider here, a little narrower there, like a parent agreeing to let a child shout in the yard so long as it doesn't wake the baby. The hush marks deepened in. Those minutes, neighborhood nets toggled to black sky settings. Hospitals voiced their power states in the calm diction of nurses. Water plants sang their flow in hashes. No one romanticized, but everyone respected. On a rooftop in Rabi, a makerspace volunteer snapped a new interlock tab into a breaker box and said, softly and the person beside her answered, as if the word had always had a response, not over. Grid operators in 3 continents ran checklists with only one correction, and that correction was written in pencil. A soup kitchen in Karachi swapped kettles to the quiet burners without losing the rhythm of ladles. The teacher over Laguna de Bay called for inside voices and got them, not because she was feared, but because the sky itself had asked politely. The old satellites survived the tantrum, not as a miracle, but as the result of collective competence, tasting the edge of a bigger shade. The third nudge had teeth. From the cold, a carbon mountain tumbled in with the long patience of ice and the short temper of rock freed from its orbit. Its vector was bad, not for Earth itself, but for the swaths of orbital clutter where human luck gets thin, a corridor busy with ComSats, a ladder of protocols newly learned by tired crews. The plot said collision family in a font that never gets big enough. Aegis did not swat it. That would have been theater. Instead, the mirrors that were not mirrors hardened to a sheen that made spectrographs purr, then leaned sunlight into 1,000 thin kisses. Ablation then, not a kill, a diet. The mountain wrote smoke. The smoke was shepherded was the word controllers used with private delight-in-tube braids that could be read by instruments and brooms. Catcher's 2 planes, a flight director said, and the sentence made sense only because the last 2 months had taught pilots to fly nets for rain they couldn't see. It rained charcoal snow. Small boats in big seas caught black confetti and cursed happily about clogged filters. A rig over the desert read the particle sizes like prayer. Beads and posted. Safe for lungs, bad for vents. Dock workers called it Broom Day. Kids wore goggles and laughed into their masks. A miner in the belt, hearing the story over a battered speaker, said, "We could use that rain." And within a day, a syndicate had redirected part of the sift. To refill dry depots out past Neptune Gate, the quartermaster watched numbers arrive in neat columns and wrote, "When the sky throws a party, cleanup is part of the party." Through it all, the dead protocol ticked and did not gloat. The subcarrier tucked hints between crests, a timing bias that made hush marks slightly deeper near understaffed hospitals, a brief teaching nudge that helped a green orbital hand catch an ugly piece of tumbling scrap without making a hero of him. The Tokwar priest read the logs and added a new Kaland response to the liturgy, who steadied the ladder, the one who climbed and the one who kept hold. On the pirate circuits, someone tried cleverness, a low-power test of a beam that wasn't a beam, meant to leak past the boundary like gossip. The boundary didn't snap. It turned the test into a long, slow breath and gave it back. "It makes you listen to your own lung," a smuggler said afterwards, half complaint, half respect. The Ket syndicated a reminder with the soft click A family uses. Soul Corridor Quiet bonus remains in force. Do not embarrass the house. Asterisk, if there was mercy in any of it. It was the mercy of design. Tests scaled to our size. Demands scaled to our attention span. Risks trimmed down to instructions useful enough to teach without burning precious hands. People who wanted catastrophe for the glory of surviving it were bored. People who liked clocks set to the right time were grateful. Scorekeepers, because there are always scorekeepers, started to tally. They counted declared burns versus surprise ones. They mapped courtesy stack compliance against sectors and found, to the surprise of the proud and the great pleasure of the overlooked, that the smoothest patches were often the ones with the fewest badges and the most battered gear. The Lagos coder wrote a line that felt like the closing of an old circle. Competence loves radio. The Chelmno curator drafted a card for her unborn exhibit that would sit under a coil of foil and hanger antenna. This is the shape of a promise, kept to a neighbor you have not met. The verdict came at night, because night is when verdicts are best heard. It did not arrive as a trumpet. It arrived as light in low orbit, a thin band of aurora that found every window seat and rooftop and sleeping sack on a dock deck. Inside the glow road, the old protocol, crisp as the first day someone had it alive, capacity for self-defense, confirmed capacity for self-caretaking. Exemplary. The sentences were not repeated. They didn't need to be. They were printed on the floor of 1,000 kitchens by whatever light was at hand. They were copied onto clipboards and up the sleeves of coats and into the margins of checklists. The Karachi ham, who had prepared himself for an exam and found a mirror, put a hand on his nephew's head and said, "We passed the part of the test that matters first." At Neptune Gate, the tug pilot stood with the quartermaster beside a viewport, so unromantic it never gets photographed, and watched the aurora walk the station's skin. "Exemplary," she said, tasting the word like a new spice, as if to make sure it did not make promises they could not keep. "It's a grade you have to re-earn every day," the quartermaster said, for once ignoring his caller. He wrote the word in his ledger and drew a small square around it, as if pinning it to the wall of a memory. The teacher over at Laguna de Bay woke to messages from parents who did not have the right words and used the right ones. Anyway, she slept through it. He asked if the sky was proud of us. They want to do another drill because it felt like a game. She printed the 2 sentences and put them beside the chalk globe. Then asked her class to name 3 ways they could take care of themselves and 3 ways they could take care of somebody else without permission, without applause. The board filled quickly. The galaxy's quiet court shifted its weight. The Toke recorded the verdict in their long archive under days when restraint taught more than arms. The Ket added a tiny bonus to the quiet corridor that only families would notice. A fee shaved, all for carriers who shared bandwidth with neighborhood nets during hushmarks. Choir mothers tuned their ships to the pitch of the aurora and found their hulls. Hummed a note that sat exactly between fear and relief. On the subcarrier, after a long interval in which nothing dramatic happened, and therefore a good many important things did, down to a quirk no one would have introduced by hand, the Lagos coder did not cheer. He closed his eyes and slept, sitting up. The curator laid her head on her desk and did the same, as if some long-postponed bell had finally been allowed to ring in the morning. The riser settled back into its now patience, The boundary breathed like a sensible animal. People went to work. Someone filed the Aurora under weather, someone else under history, and a third, more practical, under shift notes. The world did not glow with destiny. It sparkled with chores, tests, not fights, measures, not mercies. Aegis had asked whether humanity could keep its feet under a moving deck, and found, to its machine satisfaction, and whatever passes for joy, in a cathedral of mirrors and magnetic bones, that the species remembered how to sweep as well as sing. *** temptation arrived anyway. It wore the shape of a cruiser whose hull carried 3 flags because committees had decided courage must be shared. The ship's name translated differently in each tongue inquiry, polite teeth, measure twice and, all were true. Its mandate was written by careful hands. Approach within the boundary, maintain weapons gold, test only navigation. Retreat at the first rebuke. On the bridge, a captain with a mathematician's posture reviewed the orders once more and said, "To no one and everyone, we will measure the door without leaning on it." The quiet court took note the way forests note a deer without moving. Docknets buzzed briefly coalition cruiser, filing courtesy stack. Expected track, dawnward approach, high inclination, modest burn and, then returned to tide tables and soup schedules. The Lagos coder watched the transponder whisper and checked that it actually whispered. The Chelmno curator made a card titled, "Visits by Strangers Who Announce Themselves," and left the second line blank from the Neptune Gate's unromantic viewport. The tug pilot and the quartermaster saw the cruiser as a brightness with good posture. The pilot liked it. The quartermaster drew a line in his ledger beside the ship's vector and wrote, "Intent, decent, pride, measurable." The boundary did not flare. It made room the way a teacher makes room for a new voice in a classroom, by quieting the noise. She can control and letting the student hear their own tone. The cruiser crossed the first measure line, and nothing happened. It crossed the second, and everything happened very gently. On the cruiser's bridge, the captain felt it first in her teeth, as if the ship had been invited to hum a note it had not learned yet. The pilots saw it in the numbers, a delicately rising mismatch between where the burn predicted they'd be and where the instruments declared they were. Not drift, not drag. A fold. The ship's momentum found itself poured into a curve that curved back to meet its own start like a ribbon reunited with its spool. Temptation arrived anyway. It wore the shape of a cruiser whose hull carried 3 flags because committees had decided courage must be shared. The ship's name translated differently in each tongue inquiry, polite teeth, measure twice and, all were true. Its mandate was written by careful hands. Approach within the boundary, maintain weapons gold, test only navigation. Retreat at the first rebuke. On the bridge, a captain with a mathematician's posture reviewed the orders once more and said, "To no one and everyone, we will measure the door without leaning on it." The quiet court took note the way forests note a deer without moving. Docknets buzzed briefly coalition cruiser, filing courtesy stack. Expected track, dawnward approach, high inclination, modest burn and, then returned to tide tables and soup schedules. The Lagos coder watched the transponder whisper and checked that it actually whispered. The Chelmno curator made a card titled, "Visits by Strangers Who Announce Themselves," and left the second line blank from the Neptune Gate's unromantic viewport. The tug pilot and the quartermaster saw the cruiser as a brightness with good posture. The pilot liked it. "They're stepping on with their weight over the center," she said. The quartermaster drew a line in his ledger beside the ship's vector and wrote, "Intent, decent, pride, measurable." The boundary did not flare. It made room the way a teacher makes room for a new voice in a classroom. By quieting the noise, she can control and letting the student hear their own tone. The cruiser crossed the first measure line, and nothing happened. It crossed the second, and everything happened very gently on the cruiser's bridge. The captain felt it first in her teeth, as if the ship had been invited to hum a note it had not learned yet. The pilots saw it in the numbers, a delicately rising mismatch between where the burn predicted they'd be and where the instruments declared they were. Not drift, not drag. A fold. The ship's momentum found itself poured into a curve that curved back to meet its own. Start like a ribbon reunited with its spool. The quiet court murmured its appreciation the way an audience murmurs when actors stick the landing of a difficult line. The Ket updated their corridor notice. Passage encouraged, proofs discouraged. No fees for turning back with dignity. A toque captain sent a message in careful human to the cruiser's captain. We saw you. Salute. We salute your restraint. The reply, we prefer to arrive where we started with our integrity intact. Entered the liturgy in translation, under foreign wisdom. Tested, not every reaction was high-minded. In a mess hall, on the belt, a hothead held court and called it cowardice to accept a nudge. An older miner grease to the knuckles, patience to the bone, knocked his mug against the table for attention. There's a difference between being sent home from a bar because you started a fight and being walked to the door before you could start one, he said. One is shame, the other is someone who doesn't want to mop. The laughter was kind. The lesson stuck. The hush marks seemed to deepen along the cruiser's projected path for the rest of the day. A shade of emphasis no instrument could prove and every ear could feel. It's like an elder clears her throat in our direction, said the Karachi ham to his nephew, who had started to keep his own log in a spiral notebook already dog-eared by the weather of new habits. And we, the ham added, practiced not talking over her. Aegis offered a courtesy footnote in the dead protocol. A short, cool packet with a schematic for yield patterns at the boundary, matching the rose petal map from Part 3, not decryvictors that would likely please both physics and pride. The Logos coder translated the archaic units again and attached a comment that read, like a gramma's, wisdom in code. If anyone has to be first, choose the lighter vessel. If anyone has to stop, choose the one with better brakes, the courtesy. Stack gained a line. Do not test loopback without prior declaration and consent of traffic control. It wasn't law. It spread the way rain spreads through dry ground that has already loosened itself with care. A makerspace in Rabbi printed tiny yield pedal stickers and kids slapped them on scooters and kitchen timers and the corners of screens. It looked silly until it didn't. The Chelmno curator drafted a museum label that she did. Not yet have a hall to hang. Loopback lesson, Coalition Cruiser, Day 63 of the Quiet Court. Under it, 2 sentences. Aegis refused insult and returned. Intention, for its part, went home the long way, broadcasting small courtesies like breadcrumbs burn in 30, power up in 5 children, sleeping on the dark side. That last was not strictly in any protocol. It was a human sentence smuggled into the ledger by a crewman who had seen the dash of balcony lamps on a night path once and had never forgiven the universe for being both so big and so elsewhere. No one scolded him. Insurance markets adjusted to reward captains who logged fold acceptance without fuss. The Ket's quiet bonus gained a second tier that only actuaries and choir mothers cared to parse. A war college tucked the cruiser's graphs into a lecture called Dominance Without Humiliation, which was braver than it sounded because the braver part was the second half. Of the title, a neighborhood radio net added a new nightly ritual. After the last hush mark, someone would read aloud a sentence from the day's ledger that made everybody calmer. And because the galaxy refuses to be simple, a tiny fringe group announced a plan to accelerate into the boundary until it could not help but react harder. They got as far as the press release. By the time their sponsors asked politely how they planned to explain the cost to families, the group found that the press cared more about broom day fashions and the recipe for soup that traveled best